All right, thank you for the introduction, and thanks everyone for tuning in to watch this first seminar for the Focused on Forage. I'm very excited to talk about alfalfa and how it can help with nutrient cycling and with providing especially nitrogen to our cropping systems. So first things first, when we think about alfalfa as a source of nitrogen to subsequent crops, the reason why alfalfa is able to provide that nitrogen is because of its ability for biological or symbiotic nitrogen fixation. So what that means is that the alfalfa plant creates this symbiotic relationship with rhizobia, which are microorganisms, and those microorganisms have the capacity to get nitrogen that is in the atmosphere and provide it to the plant. There is a cost for the plant in order to host this rhizobia. So the plant actually provides carbon, provides energy to the microorganisms so that they may continue to function and fix that nitrogen. Now, one thing that is interesting is that this chemical reaction of nitrogen fixation is one of the most expensive in terms of energy of the reactions that we have in the environment. And that's simply because those two nitrogens that are in the atmosphere are really bonded together. So breaking that bond requires a lot of energy. We also know that there are micronutrients that are important for this reaction to occur. And that is mostly because those micronutrients are part of the enzymes that help with that reaction. So that's one of the reasons why whenever we are growing legumes in our systems, we need to be paying attention to the concentration of sulfur, iron, and molybdenum in the soil. Also, because this reaction is so expensive, it takes so much energy from the plant for this reaction to occur. We also know that if there is other nitrogen that is very readily available in the soil, so either as a fertilizer or as an organic amendment, such as manure, then the plant will choose to absorb those nutrients from the soil rather than provide energy to the microorganisms to fix nitrogen. And that's, again, is because this is such a costly, from the point of view of energy, reaction for the plant. And this is important for alfalfa because, as most of us know, alfalfa is a plant that has such an extensive root system. So it's great at mining water and nutrients through the soil profile. In terms of the amount of nitrogen that alfalfa can fix throughout the year, that can vary quite a bit from 45 to more than 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And that variation will depend on if the alfalfa is growing alone or if it's growing with other crops at the same time. So the proportion of alfalfa, if it's greater, there's more nitrogen per acre being fixed, whether or not the environmental, soil, and climate conditions are adequate, and the amount of biomass that alfalfa is being able to produce. So let's see at how we quantify the nitrogen credits from alfalfa to other crops. So typically what we do is we'll have a legume like alfalfa in a field. We're going to terminate it. That can be done either with the use of herbicide or with tillage. And then we plant a non-legume plant immediately after. And on those non-legume plants, so typically corn is used either for grain or for silage when we're evaluating the nitrogen credits. We also apply chemical fertilizer. So we apply nitrogen from a chemical source, which is readily available. Because what we're trying to see is this crop that is coming after alfalfa, is it going to react? Is it going to benefit from nitrogen? So that's a way for us to identify whether or not alfalfa is providing sufficient nitrogen for that subsequent crop, or if we need to add more nitrogen to that crop after we terminate the alfalfa. And sometimes we can also simply compare that to a typical corn on corn production system. And the idea would be also to see how that compares in terms of nitrogen application when we are comparing that to a crop that is grown after alfalfa termination. There are different ways for us to quantify those nitrogen credits. So one of them is traditional. We're just looking at nitrogen. But if we consider also the economical threshold, we get to kind of quantify other additional benefits of having alfalfa in our rotation. Some of those benefits will include better soil structure, remembering that alfalfa has a very vigorous taproot, which help create channels for water to infiltrate in the field. Having that rotation with the legume also reduces disease and pest pressure to subsequent crops and other benefits in those lines. So let's take a look at an experiment that was done in Minnesota, where the researchers were looking at nitrogen credits from alfalfa, and those alfalfa fields varied from 1 to 2 to 3-year-old stands. And they evaluating those nitrogen credits on corn grain following the alfalfa. And this was done at 2 locations, one with a medium soil texture and one with a fine soil texture. So it had more clay. So this graph here is showing the alfalfa forage mass at time of termination compared to the amount of nitrogen per acre that was available in that forage mass. And what I wanted to mention here, so we see, as I mentioned, these were fields that were 1, 2, or 3 years old. And what we see here is number 1 of the points that had a very high amount of nitrogen right here. 2 of them were 2-year-old and 1 of them was 3-year-old. And all of them came from soils that had a medium soil texture. And then on the lower level here of the amount of nitrogen, pounds of nitrogen per acre in above ground biomass, these are all younger alfalfa stands. All right, so the alfalfa was terminated in the fall with herbicide, and corn grain was planted in the spring, receiving from 0 all the way to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And just for context, in that region, the recommendation for nitrogen application is between 155 and 190 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So let's take a look at what they found in the 2 different soil textures. So for the medium soil texture, corn grain did not respond to nitrogen fertilizer if alfalfa stands were 3 years old. What that means is after a 3-year-old alfalfa stand was terminated and corn was planted, applying nitrogen up to those 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre did not result in an increase in grain production. All right. And this was in the medium texture soil. Now, generally speaking, older alfalfa stands They have a similar amount of nitrogen available in terms of pounds of nitrogen per acre, but older stands tended to provide more benefits. And what this research is indicating is that alfalfa, in terms of benefits in general, there are more benefits of leaving that alfalfa for those 3 years that are not directly associated to the nitrogen amount. So older stands perhaps have a greater, more vigorous below ground biomass root system. Maybe as they grow and develop, there is more carbon inputs to the system as well. So there are benefits associated with including that alfalfa in your rotation on top of nitrogen itself. So when they were doing this evaluation on the fine texture soils, there was less available nitrogen. And one thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about these differences in soil texture is that soils that have more clay, that have a finer type of texture, they're really good in storing nutrients, really good in storing nitrogen, but they're also really good in holding on to them because they have a lot more charges in the soil. So that may have reduced the amount of nitrogen that was being made available over time. It's just that it's a slower process if you have more clay. All right. So one thing that I'm very interested in exploring is whether or not alfalfa plant density is in itself alone a good predictor of nitrogen credits, or if we should be looking at the above ground biomass and the nitrogen concentration of that biomass to better estimate nitrogen credits. So this is some of the work that we are developing with Dr. Natasha Rain in the Soil Environmental Sciences Department. One of the conclusions is that the soil texture is a very important factor when looking at how these nutrient nitrogen credits are being passed on to subsequent crops after alfalfa. So that's also something of interest for us moving forward. So let's take a quick look at some of the other experiments that have been done here in the Midwest. One of them was done in Iowa, and this was, again, a very large experiment. There were 17 different fields that were produced with corn grain after alfalfa termination, and more than half of them did not respond to nitrogen inputs that went up to 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So if you note here in this slide, you can see that these were much older alfalfa stands, right? So again, that nitrogen from the alfalfa, in addition to other benefits of having alfalfa in your rotation, are really driving that positive response of crops following alfalfa, grown following alfalfa. There was another study in Minnesota where this was a first year corn grain. So in the Iowa study, it was a second year corn grain, which means that corn were produced in the first year after alfalfa termination, and the data that they were showing was on the second year. So again, there is this kind of long-term slow release of nutrients from the alfalfa decomposition, so that those benefits are not only on the first year, but it can extend to second year after alfalfa termination. So in Minnesota, there was this study looking at first year corn grain, and they were also looking at silage that was planted after alfalfa was terminated. And that was quite a big range of alfalfa stand ages from 2 to 7 years. And they received up to 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre.
Got a
So,
couple minutes left here, Marta.
Okay, so grain was not responsive to nitrogen fertilizer application. Again, up to 160 pounds of nitrogen did not make a difference in grain production. For silage, there was a benefit up to 36 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So again, there is benefit that is coming to the subsequent crop. This was also observed in white wheat that responded to nitrogen application in some 9 out of 12 fields after alfalfa termination. So again, this seems to be it seems to be relevant to know which species is coming after alfalfa termination. But generally speaking, the take-home message is that alfalfa can supply nitrogen to subsequent crops. This can reduce production cost, and we need to better understand how this is occurring in the soil so that we can hopefully build on the current recommendations to get more specific recommendations that will include age of stand and what subsequent crop we have. And if you're feeling super studious today, you're going to notice that the slides have little numbers. That's here, there's the actual reference if you like to explore this further. Um, but yeah, this is what I have for you guys today.